Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our expert from the library is going to work on dimming the lights a little bit, so I'm going to introduce our speaker. Most of you know her quite well as a member of the League of Women Voters, but she is the instructor of sociology at Highland College. She holds a PhD in sociology from Michigan State University and has been teaching for over 20 years. She started when she was 12. Since returning to her hometown 5 years ago, she's been an active member of the League of Women Voters and enjoys working in this organization in the mission of voter education. This issue of voter suppression is so important and so top on our list and in our hearts and minds right now, and so we were so glad she was willing to do this for us. Some of us have heard her speak before, and she is fantastic, and she has a PowerPoint to go with us. Also with us tonight is Jim Redeker, a professional videographer who's going to record the program for us tonight. So we want to welcome our speaker.
Thank you, and I'm going to try to stay up here so that I can remain maskless and socially distant from you all, so I'll try not to wander. Also, I want to try to stay near the microphone so that the people who are not in the room watching this later can hear me. Thank you for that introduction, Sharon. As she said, I'm here to talk about voter suppression. This is a topic that is very important for the League of Women Voters because what good is the right to vote if we can't actually exercise it? So tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about some history, because in order to understand this problem, I think it's important to realize this is not a new issue. We have been suppressing democracy in this country since we became a democracy. So we have a long history of deciding who can or shouldn't vote. And also, I am going to be focusing on this topic from a US-based perspective. So voter suppression, of course, goes on all around the world. It looks different in other countries, in other contexts, but we're going to focus here tonight on the United States. So just to give you a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. So, what is voter suppression? Voter suppression is really just any kind of strategy that is gaming the system, that is trying to influence the outcome of the election by preventing some specific group of voters from casting their vote. As I said, we have a history of denying certain groups the right to vote in our country. Throughout history, various tactics have been used, both legal and otherwise, and I'll give a little overview of these, by individuals as well as organizations. And one of the things I want to stress is we often today kind of look at political parties that are maybe trying to suppress different groups of voters, but if we look back, lots of different kinds of organizations tried to sway the vote. So we can see that both historically as well as today. But lots of different groups have tried to influence the outcome of an election, either through legal or outside of legal means. So I want to start with a little bit of history on what we might consider legal voter suppression. When the United States Constitution took effect in 1789, this document surprisingly does not have a whole lot of information in it about voting, right? For a country that was all about, like, we're going to be a democratic republic and here's our document, right? I've had, like, longer documents on how to put together a couch from IKEA. It's surprisingly short, how our Constitution is surprisingly short. So the Constitution took effect, and there was not a whole lot in there as far as the federal government's role in elections. A lot was left up to states, and states had lots of different ways that they defined the right to vote. Typically, most states decided that you had to be white and a male. That was pretty commonplace early in our history. A few states also restricted it to landowning males, so you couldn't be just some poor white man. You had to also be somebody who was a property owner. And some states also restricted it specifically to Christian white males who owned land. So there were a lot of different limitations, but it really was depending on where you lived, what the rights to vote looked like. Over time, the right to vote started to expand a bit. And so the 15th Amendment, and let me just back up a second. So states started making their own laws around voting. Some states prior to the 15th Amendment did start to allow free black men to vote, right? So the 15th Amendment made it federal that no state could deny the right to vote on the basis of race, but there were some states that had already begun to do that. Interestingly enough, they started that and then rescinded the right. So New Jersey, for example, was a state that had extended that right and then rescinded it until the 15th Amendment passed. Similarly, with women getting the right to vote in 1920, there were some states that already had allowed women to vote. Wyoming was an early adopter of women's voting rights in 1880. It was kind of a way to say, come on out and settle in Wyoming. We don't have enough women here, so we'll let you vote. So really, depending on where you live, determined whether you had the right to vote, as opposed to who you are determining that you have the right to vote. So the United States really had sort of a patchwork quilt effect of voting regulations. As I said, we've added on to the Constitution over time, made it a slightly longer document, although it's still surprisingly short. The 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, this was the amendment that expanded voting rights, that basically you couldn't deny voting rights on the basis of race, which expanded voting rights, theoretically at least, to African American men. There were a lot of things put in place very quickly that changed that. I also want to mention that because Native Americans were not considered U.S. citizens until 1924, that basis of race did not apply to Native American citizens, or Native Americans who were not considered citizens. The 19th Amendment, obviously many of you in the League should know, because we celebrate this not just as the right when women got the right to vote, but also when the League was founded to help women become better educated voters. The 24th Amendment, which a lot of people don't know much about, this eliminated poll taxes, which was furthered by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the 26th Amendment in 1971 was ratified, which extended voting rights to all citizens 18 years and older. Prior to that, some states, again, could pass regulations depending on age. A lot of states didn't allow voters to vote until they were 21. So these are basically the amendments we have passed to expand who can vote, who is considered somebody who is legally able to vote. But getting the legal right to vote was never the end of the story, really, for any group. It wasn't the end of the story for women. It wasn't the end of the story when it comes to various racial groups either. We often think of Jim Crow as strictly a Southern thing. At least those of us proud Yankees might feel that way. But we are not really off the hook. Armed poll watchers were common in northern states as well as southern states after the 15th Amendment passed. And basically, these were groups of armed white citizens who would stand around polling places and intimidate voters, right? If you are somebody who is trying to exercise your right to vote and you're afraid you might get killed for doing so, that's probably going to deter a lot of folks from voting. So it was a very effective measure. And like I said, this was not something just in the South. It was also something that was done in the North. However, the southern states really sort of perfected this strategy of voter suppression with a whole host of laws that we today refer to oftentimes as Jim Crow laws. So once the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, the period of Reconstruction in the South was actually a pretty progressive time in terms of voting rights for newly freed enslaved people. Or at least newly freed, formerly enslaved men. Women, of course, not having the right to vote yet. So after that period of time, we see here that more than 500,000 black men registered to vote in the South during the Reconstruction era, and more than 2,000 black men were elected to office, right? Again, in the North, we often don't really think of how many people were elected to office in that period of time, non-white citizens. So very quickly, the white Southerners, who were often in the minority in terms of, the numbers, and still in many states are in the minority, figured out how to try to take voting power away from newly enfranchised people. And so Mississippi was really the first state to figure this out. In 1890, Mississippi changed their state constitution to allow for literacy tests and poll taxes. And you might at first think to yourself, well, what's so wrong with making sure people can read in order to vote, right? On the surface, that seems pretty okay, poll taxes we might have a little bit of a problem with, maybe, but literacy tests sound like a good idea. So what made these measures so effective at targeting specifically the black vote? And make no mistake, everybody passing these laws knew full well and was very open about who they were trying to disenfranchise with these laws. Many newspapers at the time actually discussed how the poll tax was absolutely crucial to white supremacy being retained in the South. So there was no oh no, we really just want people to be more literate. There were no efforts to try to get more people to learn how to read. This was all about suppressing newly enfranchised people in the South. So in 1880, the census found that 76% of African Americans in the South were illiterate, compared to just over 20% of white Southerners. So when you pass a literacy test, which population do you think is going to be disproportionately impacted? Go figure. Also, literacy tests were very subjective. Mississippi's Constitution, the way they looked at literacy tests was that the election official should be able to point to any part of the Constitution, and the person wanting to vote should be able to read that and explain it, which, by the way, many of us might not pass literacy tests on that today. But it was very subjective. They didn't necessarily ask everyone to show they could read, and it was really up to the white election official to decide if the person had passed the test. So again, you have a little bit of a problem there. If you're trying to suppress a particular group from voting, and you have these very subjective tests where white voting clerks can pass or fail you, that's going to be very effective at keeping some groups of people from being able to cast their ballot. Also, many states, including Mississippi, included what were often referred to as grandfather clauses. If your grandfather had voted before the Civil War, you could vote. Hey, guess whose grandfathers couldn't vote before the Civil War, right? Hey. So even if you were illiterate, even if you couldn't pay your poll tax, if your grandfather was white, you probably could still cast your ballot pretty easily. But everybody else was going to have a problem. Poll taxes, again, on the surface, the claim was, let's raise state revenue, right? Make people pay a tax in order to cast their ballot. Again, media outlets were very specific that this was a key to upholding white supremacy. They did not make any bones about it. And very quickly, these measures became predominant again in the South. 11 states in the South required a tax to be paid before voting. Again, if your grandfather didn't have to pay such taxes, you were exempt oftentimes. And some states, they also compounded the poll tax. So if you couldn't pay your tax this year, next year you actually had more tax to pay. It wasn't like just, each year you got to pay $1 or $2 to vote. It compounded. So maybe if you couldn't raise the money after 5 or 6 years, you were stuck with this unbelievably high tax bill if you wanted to vote. Again, this is not to say that it only targeted black voters, but it predominantly targeted those newly enfranchised black voters in the South. And again, as is the case in many southern states today, demographically speaking, those were the majority of voters, right? If we truly had democracy, as it showed, over 2,000 black men were elected in the South during the Reconstruction period for a reason, because there were huge communities of voters who were predominantly African American. Another thing that was very effective during the Jim Crow era were all-white primaries. And this was one I hadn't actually learned much about, certainly in school. I'd heard about literacy tests and poll taxes. Many people are not aware that primaries are not run by, like, the government. These are run by political parties. This is why, Iowa has their weird caucuses and stuff like that, right? Because the political party is actually the one who runs it. So when we vote in a primary, it's being run by either the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. In some cases, there are third parties and things like that. So one of the things that many states did was the parties decided that the primary would only have white voters. And they could make that decision because it was not a state or federal election. They were running it. They get to set the rules. And so they set those rules. And so while theoretically, again, you had poll taxes and literacy tests in place, theoretically people could vote in the general election, the primary decisions were all being made by the majority, for the most part, by white voters. So these were all things that were part of the Jim Crow era of sort of that period post-Reconstruction, starting in the late 1800s, up until really the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I'll swing back around to. But voter intimidation was not something that was just happening in the South, and it was also not something that only targeted, in this case, with the 15th Amendment, predominantly black voters. We're pretty close to Chicago here, so some of you may know a little bit of your Chicago mafia and political history. Not all voter suppression was at the hands of political parties. In 1924, the election for the Cicero Town Council, which was kind of like the mayor of Cicero, was very much a contested election. And some of the folks, particularly John Torrio, one of the crime bosses in Chicago at that time, wanted a particular person to win. And he put his up-and-coming lieutenant on detail, you may have heard of, Al Capone. This is actually one of the ways he really made a name for himself, because he really was, from his boss's perspective, incredibly successful with the task he was given. So basically, Capone sent out gangs of his men to roam around Cicero, beating up presumably Democratic voters, in some cases preventing them from leaving their workplace to go cast a ballot, or physically harming them as they tried to enter polling places. The result was what has been termed the most blatantly corrupt and fraudulent election in American history by some scholars. Not only did they beat up voters like this man here, they also stuffed ballot boxes and literally arm-twisted folks into going in and putting a not-so-secret ballot kind of vote down for a particular candidate, in this case, Joseph Klenha. In 1928, they wanted to kind of repeat this in the Republican primary that year, and there was some intercession on behalf of the voters of Cicero, and the police kind of asked them, kind of had a bit of a meeting with Capone, and Capone suggested that perhaps the police could just go out and arrest all the folks they didn't want to vote and let them hang out in jail for a little while if they didn't want him to go out and beat them. And that also gets at another tactic that has long been used for voter suppression, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the coming slides in terms of contemporary issues when it comes to those who are in jail being able to cast a ballot, because that was one way that a lot of people, again, a tactic we saw primarily in the South, but we were not off the hook here in the North, of the police going up and rounding up the folks they didn't want to be able to vote and holding them, right? You didn't even have to necessarily charge people, just keep them in long enough that they were in jail on polling on the election day, and they can get before a judge after the polls close, right? So a lot of issues in our past when it comes to voter intimidation, suppressing different groups from voting, but this is still an issue that we have facing us today. So looking at voter suppression today, I want to talk about a couple of different ways we see voter suppression. I'm going to talk a little bit about just the fact of non-registered voters. While that might not fall as a tactic of suppression, the fact that we have so many people who are eligible to vote but not even registered to vote is, I think, sort of the starting point of voter suppression, right? Once people are registered, then they might face intimidation or other obstacles to voting. But if we can't even get people registered to vote, and again, if we look at who are these populations less likely to even be registered, we again see similar patterns of disenfranchised groups that we've seen throughout our history. We'll also talk a bit about intimidation. Unfortunately, it doesn't always look all that different than it did in Capone's day compared to today, although we do see a little bit difference in terms of the legality of that. We'll talk a bit about long lines and poll closures, ID laws, things like purging voter rolls, limiting early voting as well as limiting mail-in voting, and limiting voting for those who have been involved with the criminal justice system. So as I said, I think the starting point is the fact that there are so many people in our country who are eligible to vote, who have legally the right to vote, that are not registered. It's estimated that about 22% of those who are eligible to register are not registered. And the vast majority of those folks say they've never been asked. That's their reason, right? That seems like a pretty simple one to solve. And I will say that the last line there, the League of Women Voters, it has a voter registration coalition that goes around and registers voters, which is part of this, right? We do a lot of the asking, which is a good thing. Another thing that I think is very helpful in this is some of the motor voter initiatives and automatic voter registration. Motor voter initiatives is basically when you go in to renew your driver's license, or if you're, of age and get a new license and those kinds of things, they ask you, do you want to register to vote, right? Pretty simple. Takes care of that group that has never been asked, because hopefully they've been asked then. And they make it easier. And many states have adopted that measure. Along with this, Illinois, and I believe at this point it's 16 other states, have adopted automatic voter registration. So instead of asking you when you go in to renew your license, they automatically register those who have a driver's license using the information that they have from that to vote. There are problems with this system, unfortunately, which have sometimes made headlines. I know here in Illinois, there was some issues that came up long before the 2020 election, thankfully, but that there was a large number of folks who had been registered to vote who were not U.S. citizens. They had driver's licenses, but they weren't U.S. citizens, and had, in error, been pulled into the automatic voter registration system. I will say that the fact they were found long before there was an election and none of them voted because they corrected the problem kind of tells us that the system does kind of work. There are some checks and balances there, so I'm not quite as let's get rid of automatic voter registration as some people might be. And Real ID actually makes this a lot easier, because those of you who have gone to get your Real ID know you have to show proof of citizenship along with that, right? So that information is not typically part of a Department of Motor Vehicles record if you have a state ID or a driver's license, but it is part of Real ID records. And so that would actually help with that issue, because the records would be right there whether a person has eligibility to vote as a U.S. citizen. But, and again, I'll circle back to this a little bit later, this doesn't really solve the problem of voter registration, because not everyone comes into contact with the Department of Motor Vehicles, right? Not everyone has a driver's license or a Real ID, or really even any photo ID. I have a feeling I'm probably talking to a group of people who, if I asked you to prove who you are, have multiple documents you could produce. But that is not the case for everyone. And also keep in mind the expense of these things. If you've ever had to, if you've accidentally lost an ID and had to pay for another one and things like that, it can get expensive. So it doesn't solve the problem. It certainly is a piece of the solution, but I don't think we should put all our resources into, well, let's get AVR so that we just get everybody registered, because we're still not going to get everybody who's eligible to actually register. Intimidation. We do not have Al Capone and his gangs of thugs roving the streets of Cicero quite the same way anymore, right? But there are still examples in our most recent election, in elections prior to that, of voter intimidation. And I list some examples here of things that voter intimidation might look like. But there's a lot, as far as voter intimidation goes, it is against both federal and state laws. Also, a lot of local municipalities have laws against it, so we do have a lot more protections from it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't happen, or that people report it or get protected from it, right? One thing that came up particularly in the last election, but I don't want to pretend like 2020 was the first time this happened, has to do with guns in polling places. Many people might find the sight of guns intimidating, right? Whether it's, holstered or anything like that. Legally, or I should say the legality of bringing a gun into a polling place, whether it's concealed or an exposed weapon, kind of depends on what state you live in, and in some cases, what city you live in, because, again, we have this patchwork of laws, right? So depending on where you live, it may actually be perfectly legal for someone to walk in heavily armed at the polling place. There's around a dozen states and multiple municipalities throughout the country that ban guns at polling places. But also a lot of state and local laws ban guns in places like schools and churches. And where are many of our polling places? Schools and churches, right? And so in some cases, there are laws that, at least as far as that brand of voter intimidation go, would prohibit people from coming into the polling place armed. I do want to mention a couple of things that are not voter intimidation, but sometimes get mistaken for voter intimidation. And I know in some recent elections in Freeport, this was an issue with electioneering. Electioneering is the practice of standing outside of a polling place and campaigning, essentially, right? A lot of times you might stand with a sign, right, vote for so-and-so or whatever. Theoretically, you're not supposed to even wear campaign buttons into a polling place, although I have accidentally done so and been like, and felt horrible for breaking the law. But if you are outside the polling place, it's a different story. And it is a sort of time-honored American tradition that you can influence voters right up until they're going to walk into the polling place. So electioneering is not intimidation. It is legal. Electioneering does involve standing outside the polling place, and again, state laws vary. In Illinois, it's 100 feet from the polling place. It's a little sketchy as to whether that means the entrance to the polling place or the actual booth. And some people, again, you might have some disagreements there. So electioneering is not something that is actual voter intimidation. So if you are at a polling place and there are people standing a good distance from the polling place with signs, unless they're threatening or harming people, they're probably just engaging in our democratic process. Another thing, and this also came up a lot in this past election in 2020, is poll watching. Poll watching kind of can occupy a gray zone of voter intimidation. If you remember, I talked a little bit about, voting election officials and things like that, and how oftentimes in the South there'd be armed poll watchers who would stand at the polling place and, intimidate voters. Poll watching is a concept we have in our democracy that's kind of unique, but it's to ensure fair elections, right? But the activities of poll watchers are pretty limited. Again, state laws vary, but poll watchers are typically appointed by a political party or a nominee. They receive training, and they're required to bring their certification paperwork to the poll that they're going to go watch. They also have to be registered voters where they're going to watch. So I can't just show up on election morning and say, you know what, I'm going to go watch the elections in Rockford and stand in the polling place and ask people for, are you supposed to vote here? I can't do that, right? Not legally, at least. In some states, poll watchers can inspect the signature rosters where you have, the people's signatures that they have signed. They can also observe vote counting activity. There's usually a distance they have to keep from the vote counting. And again, this was something that came up in the 2020 election because you had some folks who did just show up and were not nominated by their party or certified and trained. You also had folks who wanted to touch the ballots, and many county clerks and other election officials were probably really flummoxed by that. So unofficial, unappointed poll watching is not permitted inside of polling places. But official poll watchers are absolutely, I think, an essential part of our democratic process. And when we get towards the end, I'm going to have a pitch that if you are not already involved in these kinds of things, you should be. Long lines. I'm kind of glad to be a registered voter in Freeport, where I don't think I have ever waited more than 3 minutes to vote in an election. It's pretty nice. But polling place closures have impacted the length of time that people need, or that it takes to vote. And these polling place closures have been a trend that has been made far worse by COVID. Due to COVID, in the 2020 election, some polling places did have to be closed or moved and relocated because they were in, things like nursing homes, which we didn't want a whole bunch of people wandering into nursing homes, in the 2020 election. There's a lot of research that has looked at how polling place closures are disproportionately located in poor and minority communities. So when polling places are consolidated, it's not typically wealthier communities or whiter communities that see this. Not to say it never happens, but if we look just sort of statistically, it is disproportionately impacting districts, neighborhoods, precincts that are predominantly poor and predominantly minority. There was a study from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies that reported long lines are estimated to have deterred 730,000 voters from voting in the 2012 midterm elections. And the lines for voting in 2016 and 2020 general presidential elections, those were far longer. So easy to say that probably even more folks have been deterred. In 2016, roughly 3% of voters standing in line at voting booths left before they cast their ballot. I don't want to rehash the 2016 election, but 3% might actually sway a few of those states that, in terms of which red or blue color they end up being. And in the 2020 election, poor neighborhoods were the most likely to have had to wait an hour or more for casting their ballot. The average time in 2020 was 20 minutes. Again, we're really awesome, lucky in Freeport, because most of you, well, many of you probably did mail-in or early voting, which I'll get to, but we had short lines here. 20 minutes isn't really that significant, right? If you wait 15 or 20 minutes, most people are able to do that. If you're waiting an hour or more, a lot of people are more likely to leave the line because, I don't know about you, if I'm running over on my lunch break, that doesn't usually last more than an hour. So again, on the surface, closing polling places might seem like it's something that is done uniformly or objectively, but the reality is that this has been used as a tactic to make sure that people who are not seen as desirable voters by those making decisions are the ones that are most impacted. ID requirements, and I know the text on that map is really small, so I'll read it for you. This is kind of like with literacy tests, where it sounds like, what's the big deal, right? Just as it makes sense that people should be able to read in order to vote, why not show ID, right? Like I said, I'm guessing all of us in here have multiple forms of ID we could produce in order to show who we are. So what's wrong with asking voters to prove who they are? Although this seems like something that has a long history, we actually don't see this push for voting ID laws until 2006, starting with Indiana. They started to require citizens present some sort of government-issued photo identification at the polls, and then we start to see this becoming a more popular disenfranchisement tactic, with multiple other states kind of pushing similar legislation. The rationale on the surface is that these laws are to try to prevent voter fraud, try to prevent people from impersonating another voter. And as you can see from here on the map, it's the blue states require a photo ID, the yellow states require a non-photo ID, and the gray ones do not have a requirement as far as presenting ID. Now, all states do require, when you register to vote, that you prove who you are, right? So you see, Illinois, we're in the gray. If you've registered voters, you still have to verify who they are, right? And there's various forms of proof that are acceptable to do that. But you don't have to present it every time you vote. So this, again, because not everyone has a photo ID, not everyone has a photo ID for the entire length of time they might wish to vote in our society, right? You might register to vote, and for whatever reason, you stop driving, so you don't renew your driver's license. Well, now you don't have a photo ID that's not expired, right? We also see a lot of state laws that have photo ID requirements that target different types of ID. So for example, in some states, your hunting and fishing license will count, but your college ID will not. Who do you think they're trying to get to not vote, right? In other places we see, and particularly in communities where there's a large Native American population, we've seen states that have required that your ID has your street address on it. And for many Native Americans that live on reservations, they do not have a street address. They usually have a P.O. box type system on the reservation. So their ID does not have, their street name and those kinds of things. Again, on the surface, the law is written in such a way that it seems like, well, we're just asking for people to show who they are. But some groups, and the people writing these laws know this, some groups have a harder time to do that than others. And so they are written in ways to try to disenfranchise voters. And I kind of have up here, this is a solution that's looking for a problem. And it's an all but non-existent problem, really. A 2014 analysis looking at more than 1 billion ballots cast in elections across the United States found 31 cases of voters impersonating someone else to cast a ballot. I don't know about you, but if I had to look through 1 billion of anything to find 31 cases that were fraudulent, I'd be like, well, that's just a waste of time, right? So this is really not a problem. We do not have voters we don't have people going out and saying, I'm Joe Smith, and then coming in later in the afternoon, I'm Jim Smith, right? We don't have that happening. In fact, we have the opposite problem. We have people who are eligible to vote who are not voting, right? And as I said, we do require people to prove who they are to register to vote. So having people have to make that same proof every time, every election, whether it's a general election, a state election, et cetera, is just adding an extra layer, an extra obstacle to make it more difficult for certain groups to be able to cast their ballots. Another issue that's, again, sounds like, well, why wouldn't we do this, is purging of voting rolls. And this just has to do with updating the list of registered voters by the county clerks in all the various counties across the country. It's interesting because one of the biggest examples of quote-unquote fraud that people talking about voter fraud talk about are folks who are registered in more than one place. Many of you may be guilty of this. I know my spouse was at one point in time because he did not write to the various county clerks once we moved. So he was registered, I think, for a period of time in Wisconsin, Maryland, and Illinois, right? We had a few moves in there. I, of course, being the good little League of Women Voters type person, I wrote right to my county clerk back in Maryland and, had my voter registration card and explained I had moved and was no longer needing to be on the polls, on the roster there. But here's the point. My spouse didn't try to vote in Wisconsin and Maryland, right? It was because he moved and didn't update his address or didn't write specifically to those. Eventually it does get updated. And like I said, many people have this. You move, you don't think, and if you've ever moved, there's about 1 million things you're doing, especially if you move from one state to another, and you don't think, I'm going to write to that county clerk back where I used to live and tell them I'm not going to vote there anymore, right? Nobody does that. And so a lot of times people point to voter fraud like this is potential fraud. Well, no, and there's literally like millions of people who have done this, but they're not voting in multiple places. They're voting where they're currently registered and reside. It's not an attempt to vote in multiple places. And one of the things, as I said, typically after a while those voting records do get purged. And this process, kind of varies though depending on what county we're talking about. Being too aggressive in purging the list of registered voters can leave people thinking they're registered when they're not. One of the things that, and I'll talk about some pieces of legislation have put forth, is that maybe voting in every election should not be a requirement to keep yourself from getting purged, right? Some people vote every 10 years. Should they be taken off the rolls because of that, right? So if people are too aggressive, sometimes they remove eligible voters who were registered, who haven't moved somewhere else, but just didn't vote in the last election. And those people think they're registered, because if you registered 4 years ago, you probably think it's still good, and then discover on election day, they're not registered. I do encourage people to regularly check their registration status, especially before an election is coming up. Check your status, make sure you weren't purged, and re-register if you need to. But again, this creates an extra obstacle for folks, right? Because if we want more people to vote, having them have to re-register every couple of years, and those of you who have done registration drives know it's a lot of work to get people to register to vote. Having to do that every couple of years is problematic. Early voting and mail-in voting are not new. They just got a whole lot of attention in 2020. And there's a reason they got a lot of attention. In 2020, in that election, over 100 million ballots were cast through early voting. 65 million in mail-in voting, and roughly 35 million for in-person. To compare that to 2016, there were 23 million early voting instead of 100 million, and about 24 million mail-in ballots returned. So about a quarter of the early vote and less than half of the mail-in vote compared to the previous presidential election. And that's what complicated things, to say the least, in the 2020 election. That's why, if you went to bed at a reasonable hour, you might not have known the results. In fact, it took weeks in some cases to have everything counted. But these are not new things in our society. In fact, anybody who's served in the military has probably done mail-in voting, because that is how military members vote when you're on base, deployed overseas. This is not something new. Early voting is voting at a polling place. Oftentimes, there's one polling place. For example, here, we vote at basically the building where the county clerk's office is in Freeport, as opposed to your distinct polling places. Some cities have multiple early voting polling places. But some sort of location, a polling place ahead of Election Day. And this period of time varies by state. Mail-in voting, which is sometimes called absentee voting, is not a new thing, as I said. It involves applying for a ballot, getting that ballot, filling it out on your own, and mailing it back. However, many people contend that the directions for those mail-in ballots might be a new version of the literacy test. Those of you who early voted or who mail-in voted for the first time, I'm someone who going to college and graduate school, I did mail-in voting before it was cool, but it's complicated, right? And again, there's a lot left to the subjectivity of the election officials. Does the signature match? Did you forget to put that second security envelope? Did you put your ballot in that, or did you just mail it in, right? And there's a lot of leeway for those folks to decide, does this signature match? Or should I throw out this ballot? And in some states and in some locations, they'll alert you like, hey, there's a problem with your ballot. Please come fix it. But in others, they don't. They don't even have to alert you that your ballot was rejected, right? So fixing those things is a big part of trying to deal with some of the voter suppression. As I said, we might think of this as, something that is not a new problem, but especially with COVID, has become a bigger issue because more and more people are taking advantage of early voting and mail-in voting. It also solves the problem of the fact that our elections are typically on a work day, and early voting and mail-in voting make it a lot easier for working people to find the time to vote, right? I also encourage a lot of times students to do mail-in voting, because if you're not sure who to vote for, you can sit there and you can look up, like, who is this person that's running for, county board or whatever, right? You can Google them. You're not standing in that booth being like, I don't know who these people are. So mail-in voting can be really advantageous for new voters as well. But those are the folks that, again, have struggles with, how do I even apply for this? How do I follow the directions? I know, even though I've done it a million times, I was double checking, does my signature match? Like I'm looking at my own signature wondering if it looks forged. And I know it's mine. These are things that we need to keep in mind as we think about what voter suppression looks like today. The last sort of group I want to talk about in terms of looking at voter suppression is voters that are involved with the criminal justice system in some way. State laws vary quite dramatically on whether or not people who are formerly incarcerated can vote upon their release. Some states allow for folks to vote. Some states permanently disenfranchise you if you've ever served time in prison. There's also issues related to those who are in jail awaiting trial or awaiting release. Sometimes they might not have been charged with something. Remember I said that the old tactic was, let's round up the people we don't want to vote and hold them till after the election's over, right? That hasn't necessarily gone away. And so people who are awaiting being charged or have not even committed a crime are sitting in jail, they still have the right to vote, even if you are unfortunate enough to get picked up the night before the election, right? And don't see a judge for 24 hours. Also, I mentioned poll taxes, right? Poll taxes were outlawed, but we've just reinvented them. In some states, Florida is the new Mississippi. Florida is requiring people convicted of a felony to pay all associated court fines and fees before being able to cast a ballot, before voting rights can be restored. So just like in the Jim Crow era when there was a tax on people to vote, formerly incarcerated persons are being taxed, essentially. They have to pay their court fines in order to be able to vote. And again, on the surface, this might seem like it's objective. We're just, making sure people pay their debt to society. But taking away the voting rights of people who have been convicted of felonies has been used specifically to target especially black men, who are disproportionately more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system, more likely to be convicted, and less likely to be able to pay those fees in a timely manner. In 1976, it was estimated that about 1 million people were disenfranchised based on their status as a formerly incarcerated person. By 1996, that number had gone up to 3 million. And in the 2016 election, it was estimated that more than 6 million adults were prevented from voting. And again, right, thinking about what 6 million people might do in an election, that's a pretty big population to disenfranchise. And again, overall, this is targeting predominantly black men who are affected at a rate more than 4 times greater than white men when it comes to being disenfranchised through regulations on formerly incarcerated people being able to vote. Which brings me to a fundamental question. And I would say how you answer this probably determines whether what I've just talked about is a bunch of hooey or something you want to do something about. All of this boils down to, should we make it easier or harder to vote? Should we make our democracy one that as many people as possible participate in, or one for the select few? Now, as folks who turned up for a League of Women Voters event, I'm going to guess you answer it the way I do. We should make our democracy as participatory as possible, right? We should do what we can to eliminate these barriers so that everyone, every eligible citizen who can cast a vote, casts a vote, and that vote is counted. So, a couple of things that we can do. Earlier in our business meeting, a couple of pieces of legislation were mentioned. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, named after civil rights pioneer John Lewis and former member of Congress. This is an act that would effectively bring back the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That this would, the Supreme Court has kind of chipped away at some of the protections from states changing their voting laws, and this would help restore that. It's kind of technical as far as like what it does. I'm happy to talk about it, but we can save that. But supporting this, writing to your members of Congress to say, hey, you should support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is important. Along with that, the Freedom to Vote Act. Some of you may have heard of the For the People Act earlier in the year. This was the House bill, which did pass the House, and then the Senate, as we learned about in our meeting, kind of has stalled it. It has not come up for a vote, which means it's still alive. The Freedom to Vote Act is kind of the Senate version of the For the People Act. There are some differences, but it still has a lot of the same strengths and protections. There's some compromises in it, don't get me wrong, but there's still a lot of the same strengths and protections in it around expanding opportunities to vote, cracking down on voter suppression, dealing with some of these issues of long lines, dealing with gerrymandering and redistricting reform, which has been another topic that the League of Women Voters have looked at a lot, dealing with campaign finance reform, election security, a lot of those things. So supporting those pieces of legislation, contacting your members of Congress, in the case of the Freedom to Vote Act, your senators, and encouraging them to support that bill. Also, being aware of proposals to limit voting access within the state. We often think a lot about federal election issues, but the state can, as most of these laws show, states can be sneaky. So being aware of what's going on in your state and what kinds of proposals are being put forth. ID laws do come up once in a while in Illinois, right? So being ready to have your talking points. This is why that's a bad idea, and contacting our representatives in those cases. Being an election judge. Election judges are typically paid officials, right? These are folks that actually have quite a fairly extensive amount of training. They're the really nice people that when I come in and I'm not sure where to go, they talk to me and say, right over here, what's your name? But one of the problems we have is that we have had a hard time getting election judges. And COVID has made this worse because the population that has predominantly served as election judges for many communities tends to be the same population that is most vulnerable to COVID, those over 65. And part of this is because elections have taken place on a working day, and who is potentially not working and retired and can take a day to sit and be an election judge all day, right? So, people like me who have jobs and families to contend with on election day usually can't spend the whole day sitting as an election judge. But encouraging people, making that process easier. There have been some ideas of breaking it up into shifts more so that people might be able to work a shorter time. But if you have the time, volunteer to be an election judge. Be a poll watcher, an official one, not an unofficial one, right? Don't just show up. But be an official poll watcher. I know that our political parties, the Democratic and the Republican Party here in Stephenson County, are almost always asking for poll watchers. They again, are in short supply of volunteers. And these usually are, because they're volunteers, shorter periods of time. Maybe you can only do 3 hours in the afternoon. That's okay when you're a poll watcher. Make sure you're certified, make sure you know what you can and can't do. But when you see voter suppression, it's the poll watchers that are supposed to help, right? And make sure election laws are being followed. Register eligible voters. Working with the League of Women Voters is a great way to do that. Also, make sure you're registered. Make sure you don't get purged accidentally from those polls. And as I said, working with the League of Women Voters to educate, not just to register voters, but to also educate voters about their rights, so that if voter suppression occurs, people can recognize it, they know who to contact to remedy it, because it is illegal, and how to make sure that their ballot gets counted. So, thank you. I know we're running low on time, but question.
We have time to take some questions.
Okay.
Anyone have questions for our speaker? Mrs. Toon?
Yes, Julie, since this will be on YouTube, what title should we look for to view it?
Sharon might actually be able to answer that better than me.
You say which title?
I mean, I called it voter suppression in the United States, but I'm not sure what keywords are going to be, but I have a feeling the link will be emailed out, I hope.
Once we get this all figured out, it's still not
Yes.
quite done.
Because we want to be able to tell groups of people.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is wonderful.
Other questions? There's a question over there.
Yeah, any discussion about computer voting?
So one of the things that is part of the Freedom to Vote Act is to update some of these now outdated computer voting systems to make sure that they have a paper trail that is then verified by the voter, right? So that you don't have computer systems that are, unfortunately, quickly become obsolete and don't have a paper trail that we can then verify, like, oh yes, these tallies are correct. So that is part of what's addressed in that Freedom to Vote Act, would be not necessarily doing away with all types of computer voting, but updating those systems.
So if we haven't solved this problem in 250 years, I don't know that it can be solved. It's been a part of our history, it's in our DNA to do this.
Well, as a sociologist, I've never let a problem we've never solved stop me from trying to solve it, but maybe that's why I have a lot of headaches. I mean, it does seem like we have a long history. I think we continue to stumble towards becoming a better democracy, but we definitely stumble. And I think, the pieces of legislation, if they do pass, they're not perfect, and I'm sure someone will find loopholes, and we'll try to, because we like to win, right? We want our team, our side to win, and we always seem to rig things in our favor when we can. But I do think we are, over time, getting better at democracy, despite all the stumbling we seem to be doing of late.
I hope so. You're right.
Do you think all these laws that Texas and Florida and Arizona, those places have put in place, couldn't they even be taken as a sign that we were succeeding, we were getting a lot more people out, and so the people who had the power were frightened?
I think we're probably going to see a lot more of these laws coming because of demographic change in the United States. Like I said, I mean, the South, the big reason for Jim Crow was not because, the big reason was because whites were kind of the minority, right? While we often talk about the Great Migration that occurred, as many folks after the Civil War, many black families moved north, the majority stayed and are, descendants living there today. So, and we have new immigrants, new waves of immigration that have occurred as well throughout the South that have changed that population significantly. I think a lot of people were surprised by like Georgia going blue in 2020, and I think that's really just a sign of the actual population of Georgia is not as, white and similar as people perhaps perceive in their minds, right? We have this imagery of Georgia in the South, and it's just not the case anymore. The Hispanic population has expanded dramatically. You know, we have a lot more Asian immigrants as well. Our country is, you know, changing, and I think we're going to see more laws as people want to do what they can to make sure that not a true representative democracy occurs. Because that's scary for people who have held on to power primarily because they have not represented the masses, right? Your options are rig the election, represent the masses.
I think it's worthwhile looking back to some of the sufferings people went through. I just happened to be reading this John Lewis biography now, just yesterday, I was reading the story of Fanny Hammer. And, you know, I suppose I read it years ago, but it really hits you when you review these things, because when they traveled from Jewelville to Indianola, I think, they were met by police and highway patrolmen. Only two, I can't remember how many they were, but only two could take the test at a time, and then they had to pay some kind of a fine, and then they felt that they had done what they could, and they tried to leave the state, but they were, or the place, but they were met by policemen and taken back, where the bus driver was charged with having a bus of the wrong color. Oh. So it's just stories like that get you fired up, I think, to, you know, look and really take notice of how valuable this is to be able to vote.
Yeah, I mean, whenever people say, you know, oh, my vote doesn't matter, people would not have fought and died so hard, you know, like fought so hard and died in some cases to get that right if it didn't matter.
Right.
I mean, I think that history of the folks who went through so much to get the right to vote and to exercise that right should remind us that, like, yeah, actually, when we vote, when we really participate in our democracy, that's powerful. And people have really tried to make sure others didn't exercise that power.
Until recently, I was under the illusion that the Civil War solved the issue. Now I realize it didn't.
Well, it made slavery illegal, and that's about all it really, really did. Yeah. Thank you all for letting me come and talk at you.